Welcome. In this video, you're going to understand about transaction management using Spring. Spring supports two types of transactions, programmatic transactions and declarative transactions. Firstly, in this video, you are going to understand about programmatic transactions. Later, we'll see declarative transactions. It is recommended to go with declarative transactions, but just for understanding purpose, you'll be confident if you understand about programmatic transactions. Let us get started with programmatic transactions. First, let me ask you some few basic questions. Generally, our applications will be layered, as you know: data access layer, service layer, and presentation layer. Data access layer will contain the data access code. That means will contain our data access layer, contain our data access objects, DAOs, or we call them as repositories, whatever. And service layer will contain some service classes. My question is, where do you write transactional code? Where do you start transactions? In data access layer do you start transactions, or service layer do you start transactions? Most of the people I have asked, they reply saying that in data access layer we have to start transactions. No, we never start transactions in data access layer. We start our transactions in service layer. Let me tell you with an example. To explain the scenario about transactions, I have elaborated the use case. So in my bank service, I have a method called as transactional, right? So first let me show you this project, start project. In my bank service IMPL, I have a method called as transfer, which takes from account number to account number and the amount to be transferred. Bank service IMPL is dependent on account service, so I have auto added. I'm calling debit and credit on account service. That's all. So now the actual logic is present in debit. So actually, I want the transaction to span over debit and credit. Either debit and credit both should be successful, or none of them should be successful. So actually, I need to start a transaction here and end the transaction after credit. If exception is thrown by any one of them, I want roll back. If no exceptions, I want to commit. So this is a simple use case which says that a transaction has to be started in service layer. Okay. Actually, in bank service, I'm calling one more service method, debit. Let me show you this debit method. So let me tell you about my requirement. I have tables like account, which contains the account number and balance and other fields. So whenever we are debiting, the balance should be reduced, is it? And also I want to add a transaction entry into transaction table saying transaction ID some value, account number, on which day the transaction is made, amount, and transaction type is it debit or credit. So whenever I want to debit, I have to reduce the balance here, and also I want to add a row into this table. And also for audits, I want to write an audit log message into this table. That is my requirement. So see what I'm doing in my code. Firstly, in debit, I'm calling audit service dot write audit log. What is this write audit log doing? It is inserting a row into audit logs. Okay. Then I'm finding the account object by using account number, debiting it, and updating the database. This will update the table. Sorry, this will update the table, account table. Is it? Okay. So then I'm creating an object of transaction detail and I'm calling add transaction. This will add a row into transaction detail table. So this is the logic which I have in for debit. I am writing an audit log saying trying to debit the amount. Then I am updating the account table. I am adding a new row into transaction table. Then again I am writing one more audit log saying that the amount has been debited. So I want all of them to be either successful or not. So again, this is service layer. I have to start a transaction here and end the transaction here. If any exception is thrown, I want rollback, otherwise commit. So again, coming to a repository layer where I'm doing update or find account, I should not start a transaction here. Transaction should have been already started, and I should use the same transaction here, right? So how to achieve this? I need to start a transaction in my service layer, not in my repository layer. Now my first question is, how do you start transaction using JDBC API? What you do? Connection dot set auto commit. By default auto commit is true. If on transactions connection dot set auto commit false. This is how we start a transaction using JDBC, is it? And then whenever we want to commit, I'll say connection dot commit if I want to commit, connection dot rollback if I want to roll back. So you understood that you will use connection object to start a transaction or end a transaction. Okay, but now if I have to start transaction in service layer here, I need to get connection. Oh, again, using connection object in my service layer is not a good idea. Here also using a connection object is not a good idea, right? So what? So we need to use some high level API without using a low level connection, right? Okay, that's one thing. So let's assume that I am using connection object to start a transaction. That's fine. Now, in my data access layer, if I am using JDBC API, this is a way to start a transaction. Assume that I am using connection object only in my service layer to start a transaction. But let's assume that I changed my data access layer to use Hibernate. In Hibernate, how do you start a transaction? If you have worked with Hibernate, you might be knowing you use something like session, a Hibernate session object dot begin transaction, and then you'll get transaction object, transaction dot commit, transaction dot rollback you use. So Hibernate is having its own transaction management API. So if I change my data access layer to use Hibernate, then again in my service layer, I should use Hibernate API. So whenever I change one layer, the other layer also is getting affected. Similarly, if I tomorrow want to use JPA, Java Persistence API, again in Java Persistence API, how do you do start transaction? Entity manager dot get transaction will give you transaction object, and then you use transaction object. So for JPA, again the transaction management API is different, is it? So whenever data access layer is changing, the service layer also is getting affected if I am using the API in the service layer. So what we want is, we want an abstraction layer. We don't want to use a low level connection or session or entity manager. We want an abstraction layer. Whatever might be the data access layer using, whether I'm using Hibernate or JPA or JDBC in my data access layer, I want a high level API by using which I can start a transaction or end a transaction. So for that reason, in Spring, they have come up with a interface called as Transaction Manager. This is a interface, and for this interface there are a lot of implementations. Suppose if you are using plain JDBC, then you can use data source transaction manager. If you are using Hibernate, there is Hibernate transaction manager. If you are using JPA, JPA transaction manager. If you are using JMS, JMS transaction manager. If you are using JTA, JTA transaction manager. So like that, there are a lot of implementations of transaction manager. So what you may have to do is, based on what you are using in your data access layer, you need to define one of the transaction manager in your configuration, and you inject it into transaction manager in your service layer. Let me show you what I mean. So right now I am using JDBC code. So I'll go to my XML and I'll configure data source transaction manager. So I'll configure a bean. Class is data source transaction manager. I'll give the ID as transaction manager. Okay, this data source transaction manager is dependent on data source. I'll say ref is equals to data source. Okay, so I have configured transaction manager in the configuration, and in my code in bank service IMPL, what I'll do is I'll create a variable of interface type, private transaction manager from Spring API. Transaction. Sorry, this actually the interface name is platform transaction manager, not transaction manager. It is platform transaction manager. So here I'll create a variable of platform transaction manager, and I'll just auto wire it. So interface reference can be injected with any of the implementation. So in my code, I don't know which transaction manager got injected, whether it is data source transaction manager or JPA transaction manager. It is in the configuration. So I will get the transaction manager injected. Now, in my code, I have to use this transaction manager to start the transaction, right? So whenever you are starting a transaction, every transaction can have a definition firstly. So you may want a transaction with some timeout. You may want to start a transaction with some timeout. You may want to specify some isolation level for the transaction. You may want to specify something like propagation behavior. You may want to specify some rollback policies. So like that, whenever you are starting a transaction, you may want to specify, I want a transaction with this characteristics. So you need to create a transaction definition first. There is a class called as default transaction definition is equals to new default transaction definition. So this comes up with default values for isolation level, propagation behavior, rollback rules, etc. So let's go with default as of now. Then what? Whenever I want to start a transaction, what I'll do is transaction manager dot get transaction, and I'll pass transaction definition object. So this will return me an object of transaction status. Transaction status. So don't worry about what is this transaction status as of now. We'll understand it. So this line will start a transaction with this definition. A transaction is started. Now what I'll do, I'll keep this in a try catch block. I'll keep and in a catch block, I'll catch exception. Then here I'll say transaction manager dot commit. If no exception, I'll say commit and pass transaction status. Then here in catch block, I'll say transaction manager dot roll back and I'll pass a transaction status, right? So here I will return transaction ID if everything is fine, else I will return null. That's okay. So this is the logic. Here I have started a transaction. If everything goes fine, there's a way to commit using transaction manager, and there's a way to roll back. So actually, you are actually calling a method on get on which transaction manager? Data source transaction manager. What the data source transaction manager will do is it will internally use connection object to start a transaction. Oh, how does the data source transaction manager get a connection from the data source? So internally, this data source transaction manager will get a connection from the data source dot get connection. Will get the connection. Okay, and on the connection it will say connection dot set auto commit false, and then that means transaction is started. Then this connection object will be kept inside thread local. What is thread local? Hope you might be knowing. If you want to keep any information that should be accessible throughout the thread, then you can keep such information inside thread local. Right? Any thread local data, any information which you want to access throughout the thread, you can keep it inside thread local. So the connection object is kept inside the thread local. Okay, so transaction is started here inside my bank service IMPL. How is the transaction started? It internally uses data source. The get transaction method has this code. It will use data source to get a connection, and on the connection it will set auto commit false, transaction started, and the connection object is kept in thread local. Then transaction manage.commit will internally get the connection object from thread local, and it will issue a connection dot commit. Similarly, transaction manager.rollback will call rollback on connection. This transaction manager is a high level API, so that in my service layer I will not be using low level API. Now tell me, if tomorrow in my data access layer, if I want to use Hibernate, is my service layer affected? No. What I do is here in the configuration, instead of using data source transaction manager, I'll be configuring Hibernate transaction manager. That's all. So Hibernate transaction manager gets injected here into the interface reference. Since I'm using interface reference, my code will not be affected. So service layer will not be affected whenever you change something inside your data access layer. Okay, hope this is clear. Okay, now here I'm calling account service dot debit. Now tell me, inside this debit method also, do I need to start a transaction? Anyway, I'm starting a transaction inside transfer method. Do I need to start transaction inside this debit method also? There might be a scenario where you might be calling debit method alone. In this use case, you are calling debit method inside transfer method. But there might be scenarios where debit method is called alone. If I just want to debit, I don't want to transfer, I just want to debit. So I need to take all the scenarios into consideration, and I have to write my code. So I may have to start a transaction here as well. So what I'll do is here also I'll create a variable of type platform transaction manager. Then I will auto wire it. So the same transaction manager gets auto wired. Here also I will use a similar code. Okay. Then I'll keep all this logic inside a try catch block. All this logic I'm keeping it inside a try block, and if everything is fine here, I'll say transaction manager dot commit. If something is wrong, I will say transaction manager dot rollback, and I will return null. Okay, that's fine. So here I am having the logic to start a transaction. Similarly, inside debit, um, inside credit method also, sometimes I don't know. The credit method, if I just want to credit instead of transfer, this method will be called. So here also I need to start a transaction. Okay. Then again I'll keep everything inside try catch block. And if everything goes fine, I'll say transaction manager dot commit. Sorry, transaction manager dot commit. If something goes wrong, let's say transaction manager dot rollback, and then here I will return none. Okay, so I have taken all the scenarios into consideration. Now if I'm calling transfer method, um, if I'm calling transfer method, here I'm starting a transaction and then I'm calling debit. Then inside debit method also I am starting another transaction. I feel that here a new transaction is started. But what I want is, if before calling debit method, if there is a transaction already started, I don't want this line to start a real transaction. I want to continue with the existing transaction. So one thing you need to understand is, how does this logic know whether transaction has been already started or not? Think logically. What was the transaction manager doing if once transaction is started? The transaction manager will get the connection from data source, set auto commit false, and keep the connection thread local. That means if the connection object is in thread local, what does it mean? Somewhere else in the thread, the transaction has been already started. So whenever you say transaction manager dot get transaction, the logic inside get transaction will check, is there a connection object in the current thread local? If yes, that means transaction has been already started. So this get transaction method will now not start a transaction, right? So whenever you say transaction manager dot get transaction, it may not start a transaction always. If the transaction is already started somewhere else in the same thread, this method will not start a transaction. So in the case of transfer, whenever I'm calling transfer method, here I'm calling transaction manager dot get transaction. What this get transaction will do, it will check, is there a connection object in thread local? No. So it will start a new transaction and keep the connection object in thread local, right? Then I'm calling debit. When the control comes here, again I'm calling get transaction on the same transaction manager. It will check in the thread local, is there a connection already? Yes. So that means somebody else in the same thread, somewhere in the same thread, a transaction has been already started. So this will not start a transaction, right? So this method is returning a transaction status where I can retrieve the status of transaction. So I'll check status dot is new transaction will return a true or false. This will tell whether transaction has been started right now or not, right? So in debit method, the transaction is not started. If you want to know the status of transaction, you can use is new transaction. Let me just print system.out.println in debit method, and I'll just print plus, and I'll paste it here. In debit, it will print either true or false, is it a new transaction or not. And similarly, in credit method also, I'll just put it in credit, and similarly in transfer method also I'll put it in transfer So here this should return true, that means it's a new transaction, and here in debit method or credit method it should return false. So even they are calling get transaction, it is not starting a new transaction, it will continue in same transaction. Okay, now coming to this methods, let's say update method. Here what am I doing? I am using jdbc template.update. Now what this jdbc template will do is it needs a connection to fire a query, is it? So jdbc template will look for the connection inside thread local. If there is a connection object inside thread local, it will use the same connection to fire the query. So jdbc template will use same connection to fire the query. That means the jdbc template, this method also is participating inside same transaction if you are using same connection, right? That's how the jdbc template will actually use the same connection which is present in thread local. So this method also is running inside same transaction. Okay, that's fine. Now let me check in account service IMPL in write audit log. What am I doing? I'm using jdbc template, is it? Directly I'm using jdbc template and I'm firing query. That's fine. This jdbc template will be using same connection, so this method also will be part of same transaction. That's fine. Now let me run, and then we will see whether it will work or not. So is this script executed every time? Yes, the script is executed every time. So it will create the tables, drop the tables, create tables, and see here it is inserting 10,000 into Shiva's account and 20,000 into Prasad's account. And in my test case, I'm trying to transfer 1,000 from account number 1, Shiva's account, to Prasad's account. So let us see. Let me run this test case. Everything is fine. Let me see the console. Oh, it's still running. Let's wait. This was a previous run, I guess. It's still running. Okay, so this I'll say as just transfer. Let me kill it. Spring DB only. Okay, let me kill it. It's not getting killed. What's up? Yep, it got killed now. Let me run again once more. If you see here, account updated, credit, I can see, and you can see here in transfer it is printing true. That means a new transaction has been started. In debit it is false, and you can see in credit also that new transaction is not started, it is false, right? So only in transfer method, for the first time as you are calling get transaction in the thread, this will start a new transaction. It will keep the connection object in the thread local. And in debit method, already in the same thread as transactions already started, this will not start a new transaction. So it is printing false. Everything is working fine. And one more thing I need to do here, if exception is thrown anywhere, I need to throw an exception. I'm just catching. After I roll back, I should propagate it, right? I'll say throw new runtime exception, because the exception should not be suppressed anywhere. It should be propagated to the caller. So runtime exception. 1 minute. Okay, here I'll try to throw new runtime exception. And I'll pass same as a class. So no need to return null here. Similarly, in create method also, if exception is thrown, I'm catching it and rethrowing it as a runtime exception. Here also I don't need to return none. Okay. Similarly, I think that's it, right? Yep. So let me run the test case once more right now. I'm trying to transfer 1000 from account number 1 to account number 2. So everything should be successful, and I should see in account 1000 is transferred, and in transaction detail table 1000 debited and 1000 credited, and in out logs table it's saying trying to debit and trying to credit. Now what I'll do is in the credit method I will just try to simulate an exception. So I'm just simulating an exception in credit method. So in credit method we are throwing an exception. What will happen? What should happen to the whole transaction? It should be rolled back. Is it? Let me check. So I will run. So if you see here, exception should be shown, exception should be thrown. Okay, now you are not seeing exception here anyway. Let me go to database. I'll check account. See, 10,000 is still there. It's not transferred. In transaction detail table, nothing is there. Everything got rolled back. Alt log table also, it got rolled back. So the transactions are working, right? So if exception is occurring in any one of the method, it is still working. But I assume that alt log should be present. Alt log should not be rolled back. Basically, I want to know what has happened. So alt log should be committed in any case. If you see, I'll open this implementation. Here also I'm using JDBC template. JDBC template will use same connection. So if I roll back at one place, everything is rolled back. Now I want this method to run in a separate transaction. So what I will do is in audit service also I will inject platform transaction manager. Okay. Then auto wire it. Auto wired. And again I'll try to create a transaction similarly. Then I'll keep everything in a try catch block. Here I will commit transaction manager dot commit, and I'll pass the status. And if exception is there, I will say transaction manager dot rollback. But now what I want to do is whenever I say get transaction, in the same thread already transaction is started, but I want a new transaction. I want this method to run in a new transaction. Whatever might happen to the other transaction, this should always be committed. So I want to start a new transaction. If I want to start a new transaction, I should say definition dot set propagation behavior. Let's say transaction definition dot propagation underscore requires underscore new. This says that I want a new transaction. This says that I want a new transaction, and with this definition I am saying get a transaction. Now I should get a new transaction. Let me check. I'll say system.out.println in write audit log, and I'll say status dot is new transaction. This should print true. This should always run in a new transaction, so that it will be committed, whatever might happen to the other transaction. So I have done the logic. Let me test it. I'm again transferring 1000. So you can see here on the console, lot of logs are there. In write audit log, true. That means a new transaction has been started. Let me check. In database, I'll go to account. Is this 10,000 1000 transferred? No. In transaction detail also nothing. But in audit log, you should see trying to debited successfully. Debit method got executed. Trying to credit, but there is no next message. So whatever has been written into audit logs, it has been committed. So you understood how to start a new transaction every time. If you want a new transaction, whenever it's a get transaction, you should specify the propagation behavior as new. By default, if you don't specify, it is like propagation underscore required. That means transaction is required. That means if there is an existing transaction, it will continue with same. If there is an existing transaction, it will continue with same transaction. If there is no transaction, then only it will start a new transaction. This is the default value, so I didn't specify. So in case of audit log, I want a new transaction always, so I'll use propagation underscore requires underscore, right? So hope you have understood how to start a transaction using a transaction manager, and also you understood how to specify the transaction propagation behavior. We'll see other transaction related attributes. We'll set other transaction related attributes using annotations. So this is a programmatic transaction. Now what you can do is you can just open the documentation and go through the lab documentation for programmatic transactions and run it. You'll understand whatever I have explained. You'll understand clearly. If you don't understand, go back to the video and see it again. See you in next video. In next video, we'll discuss about annotation based transactions and also XML based transactions.